Doing wonderfully. It is terrific to be here. I was in Hong Kong about 6 years ago, and it's wonderful to be back to this truly amazing and beautiful city and to this wonderful university. So as Ryan mentioned, this is a topic that gets a lot of news. So just yesterday, the New York Times reported that Trump had changed the way he was choosing his judges, that during his first term, he mostly relied on the Federalist Society, a conservative law organization in the United States, and on its president, Leonard Leo, to help choose judges. But he was unhappy with the way some of the judges he had selected in his first term had decided, and therefore he was adopting a different strategy. And so part of what I'm looking at here is, does Trump have reason to be dissatisfied with the judges he chose? Because most of the judges we're analyzing here, although I'm looking at the second Trump administration primarily, cases decided during the second Trump administration, the judges that were deciding it were the ones who were confirmed before. Only the judges confirmed in the second Trump administration are just barely coming along now, and very few of them have made any significant decisions. So I'll give you a quick summary and then I'll get into the details. Trump judges appointed by Trump do seem to be genuinely different. They are more likely to uphold anti-immigration policies. That's the focus of this paper, says immigration policies. They're more likely to uphold anti-immigration policies than judges appointed by Democrats, and perhaps more surprisingly, even than other judges appointed by Republican presidents. So in general, in political science, people often just divide judges into two parts: judges appointed by Democratic presidents and judges appointed by Republican presidents, on the assumption that most Democratic presidents and Republican presidents are relatively similar when it comes to how they appoint judges. And what this paper is showing is that may be true in many situations, but it's not true for Trump. Trump is genuinely different, just as he's different on many substantive areas. He's different in the way he chose his judges, and he is getting different outcomes from his judges. The main difference I'm going to show you is in judges who are younger, judges who are 55 and under. And there are some people who have called these judges the, quote, auditioners. These are people who potentially could get promoted from the district court to the Court of Appeals, or from the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court. And one possibility is that promotion incentives, the possibility of being promoted to a higher court, is what's motivating these judges to be different. And as we're going to see, it's a little tricky to separate out promotion incentives from the possibility that those younger judges are just more conservative. And I'll show you a little bit about how I try to disentangle those two motives. And then you'll see, for reasons that are a little unclear to me, although I have some hypotheses, that a difference between the under 55 and over 55 Trump-appointed judges is only for the last 2 years. It's not, doesn't seem to have affected their decisions during the Biden administration or during the first Trump administration. I also have some results that are not in the paper on the first Biden administration. I'll get to them later. And of course, this is a working paper. There are some other things that I hope to do that I'll signal up front. I plan to do some more work on the question of ideology versus promotion incentives. And I'm also hoping to expand this paper beyond immigration. Immigration was a great place to start, but it means that the data set is somewhat small. And so I hope to expand it. That will give me more statistical power and allow me to do more sophisticated things. Of course, in order to do that, I'd either have to hire a team of research assistants, or the wonders of technology today, I'm working with some people to train an AI model to code the cases in the way that I'm doing here, using immigration, which was coded by a research assistant as a training data set, and then expanding that to other areas. So for those of you who read the paper, I just want to highlight how the presentation today is going to be a little different than what you saw in the paper. As I mentioned, this is a work in progress. So I have a research assistant who's been coding more cases, and I got a new tranche of cases relatively recently, and I stayed up late last night doing the analysis so I could give you the latest results based on the full data set I have. So whereas the paper that I distributed before was based primarily on cases during the first Trump administration between January and August, this paper has cases through April, through last month, through this month. And the pace of litigation is very heavy, so that more than doubles the number of cases I have from the second Trump administration. And I have more cases from the Biden administration. The paper had some preliminary analysis of early data on the Biden administration. I now have the full data set for the Biden administration. And I also have data from the first Trump administration. So I now have roughly nine years of data, whereas before I had 8 months. And I now have some better data on ideology scores, which I'll talk about later. And so hopefully it won't be too confusing. I'll try to highlight places where the paper might be different, but I'm going to emphasize the new results rather than the preliminary results that are in the paper. Okay, so the basic background is presidents, at least in the United States, are often disappointed in their judicial nominees. So President Eisenhower, who was the president of the United States in the 1950s, said the biggest mistake he ever made was the appointment of that, quote, son of a bitch, Earl Warren. So Earl Warren was turned out to be one of the most liberal and most effective Supreme Court justices and chief justices in US history. He was the justice who presided over the court when it decided Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating American schools. He presided over the court when it revolutionized criminal procedure, protecting rights of criminal defendants from unlawful searches and seizures or things like that, but was extremely controversial and not at all the centrist conservative like Eisenhower was. And so he thought, so Eisenhower was very, very upset with his appointment of that judge. And that is not unusual. Presidents are often disappointed by the judges they appoint. So for many years in the United States, we had a constitutional right to abortion. It's been for 50 years, it was the Republicans' goal to reverse the rights for abortion. But 3 Republican appointees in the mid-'80s affirmed the right to abortion in the Casey case, including judges who've been appointed by Ronald Reagan. And again, judges often disappoint their people who appoint them. And that's largely because in the United States, judges have life tenure. And especially the Supreme Court, they have life tenure and no prospect of promotion. And so they are not easily controlled by the executive. On the other hand, lower court judges, although they have life tenure in the United States, at least if they're federal judges, they may desire to be promoted. And that provides a lever through which presidents can perhaps influence the behavior of nominees. There is a growing literature on the judges appointed by Trump. I've listed it here. I'm happy to go over it if people want, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. And then it has attracted attention in the press because, well, the judge is very important in the United States. And so there's a January New York Times article on this, and there's one last week. I think I can do things better than the New York Times, but the New York Times is an extremely good paper, and they actually do some impressive quantitative analysis. Okay, so what in particular I'm looking at? I'm looking at what are called Article 3 federal judges. So in the United States, we have 2 sets of judges. We have the federal judges who are appointed by the president, and we have state court judges who are appointed in various ways through the states. I'm not looking at state court judges. I'm only looking at those federal judges. State court judges often don't have life tenure. Federal judges all have life tenure. The federal judges in the United States are at multiple levels. There are trial court judges who are federal judges. So in California, the state where I live, there are both a federal district court, a federal trial court, and a state trial court right across the street from each other. But the federal courts are unlike in, say, Germany, where the federal courts are purely an appellate bench. In the United States, we have federal courts at the trial level, at the intermediate appellate level, and at the Supreme Court level. I'm looking at 2017 to the present. So the first Trump administration, the Biden administration and the second Trump administration. And I'm looking at cases challenging Trump or Biden immigration policies. So I'm not looking at your run-of-the-mill immigration cases. There's millions of cases every year that decide whether a certain person should be deported or given citizenship or things like that. I'm not looking at that, although that's very interesting. Those are decided by judges who don't get life tenure, and there's tons of evidence that they are affected by the presidential administration, because they literally can just be fired if they make decisions that the attorney general or the president doesn't like. But I'm looking at the decisions about immigration policy. So in both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, there have been major changes in immigration policy, mostly done through regulations or executive orders rather than through legislation. And there's often been questions about the legality of those regulations. So there are basically two sorts of issues that come up about those executive orders and regulations. One is whether they exceed the statutory authority that was given to the administrative agency that makes the regulations. And the other is whether, or if it's an executive order, whether they, again, exceed statutory authority, or whether they're just flat unconstitutional, because in the United States, even if there's statutory authority, if it violates the Constitution, that is not valid. So I'll give you two examples. President Trump, on his first day, issued an executive order which restricted what in the United States we call birthright citizenship. Since the mid-19th century, it's been the understanding, partly based on the US Constitution, 14th Amendment, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen, with narrow exceptions for the children of diplomats. And President Trump didn't like that. He said, I don't want to give citizenship to the children of illegal aliens. And I don't want to give citizenship to the children of people who are here on short-term visas. Why should a tourist who happens to have a kid in the United States, why should that kid get citizenship? And what about students? Why should someone here on a student visa who has a kid, why should their kid be a citizen? So he issued an executive order that said, well, birthright citizenship, yeah, that's the general rule, but it doesn't apply to people, to children born of illegal immigrants or people who are here on short-term visas. That has raised enormous constitutional questions, because it's been understood for over 150 years now that birthright citizenship includes the children of illegal aliens and the children of people on temporary visas. So that's one example of the type of decision which is, I'm analyzing this case. How are the district courts, the courts of appeals, and the Supreme Court analyzing and voting on that issue? That issue itself has been litigated in multiple courts, and so we have lots of different judges appointed by different presidents opining on the constitutionality of that. Actually, they almost all find it's unconstitutional, but we'll see what the Supreme Court says when it gets up to the Supreme Court. Another example, under the Biden administration, actually going back earlier, even under the Obama administration, we've had a huge problem with deadlock in Congress, very hard to get any legislation through. Even immigration policies that are relatively popular, like giving citizenship to kids who were brought here by their parents when they were infants, a policy with broad popularity across Republicans and Democrats. It's been impossible to get any legislation on it. And so Obama and later Biden were very frustrated, and they said, well, if we can't get legislation, we'll do it through regulation. They established a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals that basically said, well, we can't give them citizenship, but we won't do any immigration enforcement against them. We won't deport them. We'll give them work permits, and we'll basically allow them to stay. We'll give them all the legal status we can other than citizenship. And that policy was challenged as exceeding the president's authority. Look, you tried to get legislation, you couldn't get legislation. The law on the books is those people are illegal aliens, they should be deported. And yes, the president has the power to make limited exceptions in individual cases, but you can't just, the argument was, you can't just exempt several million people from immigration enforcement. So that was challenged in the court. So we have challenges both from the left, that is, the challenge of the birthright citizenship policy is a challenge from the left, from pro-immigration groups, and we have challenges from the right, a smaller number of them, but we have challenges from the right against more liberal policies like deferred action for childhood arrivals. The data set was assembled for the second Trump administration by a wonderful website called Just Security, which has a litigation tracker which tracks all these cases. And then my research assistant mimicked the search strategies for that to go back in time to the Biden administration and the first Trump administration. The unit of observation of my analysis is the judicial vote. So not the case. So that means if we have a district court case, except in some very unusual situations, that means we have one vote per case. But once it goes up to the Court of Appeals, we have 3 judges voting. So that means we have 3 observations per case that's appealed, plus the one at the lower court. And if it gets up to the Supreme Court, we have an additional 9 because we have 9 votes. So I'm analyzing judicial votes rather than cases. And so while there are many more trial cases, once you look at votes, the number of votes are pretty similar across the 3 levels because you have 3 times as many votes for every Court of Appeals case and 9 times as many votes for every Supreme Court case. The cases at this point were coded by a research assistant. Relatively simply, did the decision uphold the government policy, or was it against the government issuing an injunction against the enforcement in part or in whole of the government policy? And then, of course, my research assistant also coded a whole bunch of things: the birth year of the appointing president, the birth year of the judge, who the appointing president was, and whether the challenge was from the left, either by an immigration group, or from the right by a conservative state or an anti-immigration group. So this is the most simple graph of what's going on during the second Trump administration. You can see what we've got here is I've divided the judges into 3 groups. Whoops, that's not what I want to do. Into 3 groups. Oh, there. You have divided the group judges into 3 groups. There are judges appointed by Democratic presidents, so that's mostly Obama and Biden. Judges appointed by President Carter in the 1970s have mostly retired or died. Republican appointees, excluding the Trump appointees, so this is mostly appointments by Presidents G.W. Bush and H.W. Bush, and then the judges who are appointed by Trump. And then the vertical axis is percent of votes favoring the government. During the second Trump administration, all of the attacks are from the left. That is, we have immigration groups that are challenging Trump executive orders and regulations. So a vote for the government is a conservative vote, and a vote against the government is a liberal vote. And as you can see, there are huge differences depending on who the appointing president was. The Democratic appointees voted to uphold the government policies only 15% of the time. That is, in 85% of the times when they voted to enjoin, to prevent the enforcement of the government policy. On the other hand, if you look at the various Republican appointees, whether they are appointed by Trump or by other Republican presidents, they voted to uphold the government policies over half of the time. The difference here between the Republican appointees by presidents other than Trump and by Trump is a little difference. It's 12 percentage points. It's not statistically significant. When you look at all the judges together, Trump appointed judges and other Republican appointed judges look pretty much the same. Now, one thing to point out is that even the Trump appointees are voting against the administration quite a bit. They're voting against the administration 34% of the time. So while they're voting for the administration a lot more than Democratic appointees, they're exercising some independence. And Trump has some reason to be disappointed in them. If he was expecting 100% voting aligned with him, he's not by any means getting that. But he's certainly getting judges who are different from the other judges on the courts. Okay, good. This difference, of course, is highly statistically significant between Democratic appointees and the Republican appointees. Okay. Things look a little different when you break things down by court level. So when you look at the Supreme Court, when you look at the Supreme Court, you can see that there's still a huge difference between Democratic appointees and Republican appointees. And now the Trump appointees vote to uphold Trump policies a little less than other Republican appointees. But again, this difference is not statistically significant. So when you look at the Supreme Court, you have that same basic divide. There are Democratic appointees and there are Republican appointees. And it doesn't look like the Trump judges are that different. If anything, maybe they're a little bit more liberal than the other Republican appointees. And that's not surprising. Those who follow the Supreme Court will say, who are the most conservative Supreme Court justices? Thomas and Alito. Those were not appointed by Trump. The Trump appointees Supreme Court have been surprisingly moderate. Think about Kavanaugh, think about Gorsuch. They're not Amy Coney Bryant. These are not liberals by any stretch of the imagination, but they are not extreme right-wing ideologues. And that's reflected in their votes on the immigration cases. On the other hand, if you look at the lower courts, now things look very, very different. So this is the district courts and the courts of appeals. Now there's a huge difference between the Trump appointees who uphold Trump policies over half the time, and other Republican appointees who are voting against Trump policies, against their legality and constitutionality, over 2/3 of the time. Okay, and there is even a greater difference with the Democratic nominees, but in some ways, the Republicans appointed by other presidents, like President Bush, are more similar to Democratic appointees than they are to the Trump-appointed lower court judges. So the Trump-appointed lower court judges are very conservative, and they are very strongly upholding the Trump policies on immigration, in spite of what the consensus in the legal community that many of them are illegal or unconstitutional. Now, even they, again, are saying that nearly 40% of them are illegal or unconstitutional. So they're not down the line voting for Trump policies, and that gives Trump some reason to be disappointed in his nominees. But there's a huge difference on the lower courts. Now, this slide further breaks out what's going on the lower courts by the age of the judge at the time they make the decision. And it breaks it out by judges who are under 55 and judges who are 55 or over. Now, there's nothing magical about 55, but in general, you're much more likely to be promoted from a lower court to a higher court if you're younger. If you're a president and you're thinking about who you want to have on the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, you want a judge who's young, because in the United States, we have life tenure. If you appoint someone who's 50, chances are they're going to serve 30 or 40 years. If you appoint someone who's 70, they probably only have 10 or 20 years left on the court. So you double or triple your impact by promoting judges who are younger. And in general, if you look at the patterns, 55 is about the cutoff. It's certainly the cutoff for U.S. Supreme Court. There hasn't been a justice appointed Supreme Court who's been over 55 for quite some time. At the Court of Appeals, there's no hard cutoff, but the probability of being promoted goes down significantly after 55. And one of the things that you can see is that if you look at the Trump appointees, which are these two bars here, there's a huge difference between the Trump appointees who are under 55. They vote to uphold Trump immigration policies 85% of the time. So now we're getting pretty close to 100% when it comes to the younger Trump appointees. But the older Trump appointees are voting to uphold Trump policies only 30% of the time, which is not that different from Democratic appointees. It's still a little bit more, but not statistically significantly different from Democratic appointees. Now, there's also a small effect for over and under 55 for Democratic appointees. And this is different from what I had in the paper. This is a new result from the bigger data set. the Democratic appointees who are who are younger are now more likely to oppose what the Trump administration has done. They are less likely to uphold Trump policies. And that could be either because they're more liberal, or it could be because they anticipate that sometime in the future there'll be a Democratic president who might appoint them to a higher court. The difference is only 10 percentage points, but it is statistically significant. Okay. Now, the fact that under 55 judges decide things differently than over 55 judges is consistent with a theory that the younger judges are auditioning for a higher court, that they are angling for promotion. But it isn't really conclusive proof of that fact, because it could just be that younger judges are different ideologically. Maybe younger judges appointed by Trump are more conservative or more anti-immigrant, and maybe younger judges appointed by Democrats are more liberal and more pro-immigration. And this would be consistent with some things that we see in the world generally. Younger Republican voters and older Republican voters are different. Younger Republicans in general are more Trumpy, more aligned with Trump's policies, which are different from traditional Republicans. And older Republicans would be more like the people who grew up under Ronald Reagan or Bush, more traditional conservatives, free market, somewhat pro-immigration, and not particularly aligned with all of Trump's views. And similarly for Democrats, there's some evidence that younger Democrats are farther to the left on a number of policy dimensions. So one of the things we want to do to disentangle this question of ideology versus promotion incentives is see if we can measure ideology and see if the votes of the judges is explained by their ideology, or is it explained better by their possibility of promotion. So we have to measure ideology. One way to measure ideology, we're going to turn out the first way I thought of, but probably not the best way, is by looking at whether you're a member of the Federalist Society, a group of conservative judges and law students. Another is developed by law professors and political scientists called dime scores, which look at people's contributions to political campaigns. So in the United States, individuals are allowed to contribute with some limits to political campaigns. And by looking at which candidates people make campaign contributions towards, you can get a sense of people's ideology. Someone who contributed to the Hillary Clinton campaign or to the Kamala Harris campaign is probably more conservative than someone who contributed to the Trump campaign. And that's true also at congressional or local levels, that people who contribute to conservative candidates are more likely to be conservative, and people who contribute to liberal candidates are more likely liberal. And then political scientists have developed tons of ways of scoring politicians at all levels for how liberal or conservative they are. And now we can, by looking at campaign contributions, score individuals by which politicians they contribute to. Another set of ideology scores, somewhat more established, are called the common space scores. And they look at the president who appointed them and the senators in their states, and the ideologies of the presidents and those two senators, with the idea being that senators have some influence over who gets nominated to a federal judgeship in their area. And so by looking at the president and the senators, we can get a sense of the likely ideology of the judges. That is, more conservative presidents are more likely to appoint more conservative judges, and whatever the ideology is of the president, you're more likely to get conservative judges in conservative districts than in liberal districts. So the first thing I did was just check, are there differences between Trump appointees 55 and under and over 55 in terms of these three different measures of conservative ideology? And the results are mixed. If you look at Federalist Society membership, there's a huge difference. The younger appointees are way more likely to be members of the Federalist Society than the older ones. On the other hand, if you look at the DIME scores, that's the political contribution scores, there is some difference. The more positive means more conservative, so 0.94 is bigger than 0.64, but it's not a statistically significant difference. And if you look at the JCS scores, which are probably the most established measures of how conservative people are, there is no difference. I mean, technically, the over 55 appointees are more conservative, but there's no statistical difference. So if you just look at the measures of ideology, maybe the younger judges are more conservative. Not at all clear. Yeah. So that's a really good question. So the Federalist Society is an organization mostly initially started, I think, on college campuses. So, for example, I was at the University of Chicago, which had a very active Federalist Society when I was a student. And people would go both because it was a lively intellectual place. There were interesting lectures and debates. And also, as you point out, because it was a way of establishing a network, and often it helped people get good jobs, especially judicial clerkships. And that has become increasingly important over time. As there have been more and more conservative judges on the bench, membership in the Federalist Society has been an increasingly important factor in helping people get clerkships. So on the one hand, it's a career thing. People often join because they think it will advantage their career. But you only do it if you are interested in advancing your career through the conservative network. And so you are signaling your conservativeness by joining. The main reason I think this is a bad way of measuring how conservative people are is that the Federalist Society was only really founded in the 1980s and only became particularly important in the 90s and 2000s. And so the reason that the younger appointees are more likely to be members is they became they entered the legal profession when the Federalist Society was an important networking and intellectual organization, and the older judges may have been just as conservative, which is what you see by the other two measures, but they just entered the legal profession at a time when the Federalist Society was not as important for networking or other purposes. But I use the Federalist Society membership because some other papers have used it. We're going to see how much it really impacts things. So this slide is a little ambiguous. It suggests that maybe the younger appointees are more conservative, but the evidence is not really strong. So the next thing I tried to do is I ran a series of regressions where I tried to predict whether judges would uphold or not uphold Trump administration policies based on their age and on their ideology. So the basic idea would be, if it turns out that younger judges are just more conservative, then when we run these regressions, the age will not have an impact on how they vote, and all of the conservativeness of the voting will be explained by the ideology rather than by the age. So Model 1 is the baseline. It suggests that what we knew already, that age is a very strong predictor of whether people are going to vote to uphold Trump administration policies. The coefficient there means that if you're 55 or under, you are 55% more likely to vote for Trump administration policies. It's a huge effect, both in terms of how big it is and in terms of its statistical significance. And then in the other models, we're adding the controls for ideology. And so, for example, you can see Federalist Society is also highly predictive of being voting conservative. But even factoring in whether you're a Federalist Society member, the being 55 or under still predicts being more conservative in your voting. And that would suggest that, yeah, there's some role of ideology, but there's an important role of age. That would suggest that the roles of ideology and age are about the same. And controlling for ideology reduces the impact of promotion, but it's still huge, 34 percentage points. That's a huge, huge effect. And then models 3 and 4 control for the two other ways of looking at ideology, the DIME scores and the JCS scores, and we have similar results. That is, regardless of controlling for ideology, we have a very strong impact of age, suggesting that promotion incentives are acting independently of how conservative the judge is. And then the last model, I throw all of the three measures of ideology in together. I was actually quite surprised that there was anything left in this regression. It's a relatively small number of observations, 44, and usually once you put in this many possible explanatory variables, you're left with nothing being significant. But the coefficient on age, on being 55, remains very strong, 35%, statistically significant at the 5% level. And the only other, the ideology scores that gets any traction is the DIME score, and even that is only marginally statistically significant. So this is different from what you saw in the paper. In the paper, I had much more ambiguous results about the relationship between ideology and promotion incentives. Now I have a slightly bigger data set, and I have better measures of ideology, and I was actually quite surprised myself, but it looks like the promotion incentives are pretty robust to controlling for ideology. Yeah. This is at the vote level. So one of the things I should figure out how to do, this is a pretty quick and dirty regression. There aren't many judges who voted who had more than one case, but there are a small number of them. And I probably should figure out statistically how to do maybe some clustering or something like that. One thing just to know, one of the things I did that largely obviates this problem is that as a case moves through, their judges make many, many decisions. So a district court judge might decide trivial things like the briefing schedule. It might decide whether to allow an amicus brief. It might decide whether to allow a temporary restraining order, which is a very preliminary injunction for a short period of time, and then decide on a preliminary injunction, which is an injunction for a little longer, and then decide on the permanent injunction. I only count the last one. I only count the permanent injunction. If there's only a temporary restraining order, I count that. But if there's a later order that supersedes the earlier one, I only count the later one. So that means that even though judges are making dozens of decisions, in general, I'm only counting one. There are some situations where I count them twice. So for example, if there's a preliminary injunction and then it goes up on appeal and then the appellate court sends it back and then the district court has to decide under a new legal standard, I will count that twice. So that's why we do have some judges voting twice. And you're absolutely right. I should control for that. Okay. So, this is not bad. It's a little crude. It's not great. But I hope to do a little bit more on this question of ideology versus promotion incentives. So one thing I want to look at is change over time as judges get older. If I'm right, judges should be conservative when they're younger, and then later on they should get more liberal. Unfortunately, it looks like we don't have enough repeat votes by the same judge over a long period of time to be able to do that. But maybe 20 years from now, I can do that analysis. Yeah. Okay. I also have some analysis of voting in the Biden administration. That is, there were Trump appointees because Trump nominated judges during his administration before Biden became president. How does the voting look on immigration challenges during the Biden administration? Now, things are very interesting in the Biden administration because now Biden is sort of a centrist kind of guy. And so we have challenges from the left and the right. So we have challenges from immigration groups claiming that the Biden administration was too restrictive on immigration. But we also have challenges from the right claiming the Biden administration was too pro-immigration. And so what I do here is I separate out challenges from the left, that is from pro-immigrant groups, and challenges from the right from anti-immigrant groups. And we can see, of course, the voting is very, very different across those two groups. And now, in addition to looking at Democratic appointees as a whole, I separate out the Biden appointees and the Democratic appointees other than Biden. Now, challenges from the left are pretty much what you'd expect. Democratic appointees in general vote to uphold the government policies less frequently. So that is, they're voting pro-immigrant 60% of the time, anti-immigrant 42%. And the Republicans, whether they're appointed by Trump or not, are voting to uphold the government actions much more. That is, they're voting to uphold restrictive immigration policies, even though they are policies put in place by a Democratic administration. You could have thought, well, the Republican appointees would just vote against the Democratic administration. They would vote politics rather than policies. We don't really see that. But the real surprise here is the Biden appointees. They are voting overwhelmingly to uphold Biden policies, even when they're anti-immigrant. So they're acting very differently from other Democratic appointees who, for the most part, don't uphold those anti-immigrant policies. And they're actually, in some sense, more conservative even than the judges appointed by the conservatives. Now, my N is really small. It's only 7. But this looks to me like the Biden appointees are being very loyal to the president who appointed them. On the other hand, if you look at votes for the government when we have challenges from the right, so this is a conservative challenge arguing that Biden administration policies are too liberal. Now we see a huge difference between the Trump appointees and other Republican appointees. We see the Trump appointees essentially never side with the government when there's a challenge by a conservative group, whereas the more moderate judges appointed by the more moderate presidents are more likely to be skeptical by claims by Texas or other conservative states that the Biden administration policies are too pro-immigrant. I couldn't do much with, I checked here for whether there's differences based on the age. I didn't find any differences here. I was a little surprised about that. And then I also looked at judicial voting during the first Trump administration. It looks like it's simple ideological voting. So Democratic appointees vote to uphold policies from challenges from the right only 8% of the time, and Trump appointees 81% of the time. Looks like the Trump appointees are more conservative and they are voting to uphold Trump policies. But there's no evidence of auditioning. There's no evidence that the numbers are different for under 55 and over 55. I can't be really sure because the numbers are small, although I do have a theory. The Trump appointees are mostly deciding cases towards the end of the Trump administration because they get appointed over time. There are only really substantial numbers of them towards the end of the first Trump administration. At that point, it looks like Trump is going to lose the reelection, as of course he does. And so they might be thinking, there's no point in voting for which is going to get me promoted because I'm not going to get promoted because by the time I'm eligible for promotion, it's going to be another administration and they're not going to vote based on that. Now, why the Democratic appointees might not have had promotion incentives is less clear, although the Democrats are more conflicted on immigration, and it might not have been clear whether being pro-immigrant or anti-immigrant was going to be good for promotion. Okay, so next steps, I need to do more on the ideology versus auditioning issue for Democratic appointees, especially under the second Trump administration. As I mentioned, I do plan to look at some other areas, maybe protection of federal workers, environmental regulations, affirmative action, DEI. And for this, I'm hoping to use AI tools to help me code because my RA has more important things to do this summer, like making money. No, well, that too. So in conclusion, it looks like Trump judges are different, especially Court of Appeals and district court judges. They're different not only from Democratic appointees, but also from other Republican appointees. And this is especially true for judges who are under 55 in the second Trump administration, where it looks like they're auditioning for promotion. And I've got some more to do, but I welcome your comments and suggestions.